The train screeched away, leaving Hazel Marie stranded on the sun-bleached platform, its iron wheels carving a jagged scar across the horizon she'd clung to for days. Her suitcase, stuffed with creased letters from a man who'd stopped writing, a threadbare shawl, and the faintest hope she'd dared to pack, felt heavier than the desert air warranted. The town of Mercy, a cruel irony, she thought, stretched before her like a wound. Buildings hunched under a merciless sky, their windows shuttered against outsiders, their inhabitants clustered on porches like crows, eyes sharp with unspoken verdicts. Amos Reed, the widower who'd once praised her elegant hand in letters inked with cautious optimism, had vanished the moment she'd confessed her barrenness. His silence wasn't just rejection. It was a mirror held to the world's verdict. You're broken, unfit even for the scraps of love others discard. Yet here she stood, a woman shaped by the ache of being too much, too honest, too flawed, and never enough. Never fertile, never young. Her boots, sturdy but ill-suited for the graceless art of arrival, kicked up dust as she trudged toward Miriam Fay's boarding house, its peeling sign a promise of hospitality long expired. The landlady's words, "He didn't think it worth the awkwardness," gnawed at her, a phrase polished smooth by the tongues of those who'd whispered her name in Boston's parlors. But it was the stranger at the general store who unraveled her despair. His voice, low and steady as a plow line cutting through stubborn soil, cut through the town's chorus. Folks talk. They don't know what they're talking about. His eyes, blue but not cold, had lingered on hers, not with pity, but a quiet recognition that felt like a hand brushing hers across a chasm. Who was he, this man with dirt under his nails and a gaze that refused to look away? And why did his presence, fleeting as it was, feel less like a stranger's chance encounter and more like a promise the universe had tucked away, waiting for her to find? The days after Amos Reed's abandonment bled into one another like ink spilled on parchment. Each moment weighted with the suffocating certainty that Mercy, the town, would never let her forget her worthlessness. Miriam Fay's boarding house became a cage of its own, its creaking floors and stale air thick with the landlady's venom. A woman's reputation, she'd sneer, polishing silverware with a cloth worn thin as Mercy, is a mirror. Crack it once, and even God can't mend it. Hazel Marie scrubbed her hands raw in the kitchen, peeling potatoes until her nails turned black with dirt, swallowing the barbs like bitter pills. But the town's cruelty was a slow poison, its whispers seeping through cracks in doors and windows, coiling around her like a noose. Then came the children, a girl with sun-browned knees and a braid that defied gravity, a boy with a gap between his teeth wide enough to whistle through, bearing a pie so lopsided it seemed to defy geometry. "Uncle Micah says people forget to be warm," they announced, their voices bright as the wildflowers tucked behind the girl's ear. Hazel Marie stared at the pastry, steam curling from its lopsided crust, and wondered if kindness could be a weapon against the cold. She avoided Micah's porch for days, as though proximity might tether her to the fragile promise he'd offered. But the pie lingered, uneaten, on her attic windowsill, a silent challenge. On the fifth morning, she rose before dawn, the sky still bruised with night, and wrapped herself in a shawl thin enough to see stars through its frayed threads. The walk to his ranch felt like stepping into a dream half remembered, the earth soft beneath her boots, the air sharp with the scent of sagebrush and possibility. She found him splitting firewood, his axe biting into the log with a precision that bordered on reverence. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt, glinting on his neck like a secret. He didn't pause, didn't ask why she'd come, just set the axe aside and reached for a book resting on the porch railing. A volume weathered by time, its spine cracked like the mirror in her boarding house room. "They miss being read to," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to settle into her bones. The pages fell open to a story about a girl who outgrew her cage, her wings clipped by those who feared her flight. Hazel Marie traced the margins, where a previous reader had scribbled notes in the margins. Escape is a verb. Roots can break stone. Micah watched her, his silence not the hollow void she'd known in Boston parlors, but something active, alive. It pressed against the edges of the morning, holding the town's judgments at bay. When the children burst onto the porch moments later, their laughter scattering like startled birds, Hazel Marie realized she'd been holding her breath. The girl, Rosie, she learned, tugged at her skirts, demanding a story. The boy, Jed, perched on the arm of the rocking chair, eyeing the book like it held treasure. As Hazel Marie read, her voice tentative at first, then steadier, she felt the weight of the past loosen its grip. But the town was a hydra, its heads multiplying in shadowed corners and church pews. Already, Miriam Fay's eyes had narrowed at the sight of Hazel Marie's lingering threadbare gloves on the general store counter, at the way Micah's shadow darkened the doorway when she entered. Already, rumors coiled like smoke through the saloon, where men traded tales of her impropriety over whiskey and regret. Hazel Marie knew this kindness, a man offering a book instead of judgment, children demanding stories instead of pity, was as fragile as the pie's uneven crust. Yet as the sun climbed higher, painting the fields in gold, she let herself believe, just for a heartbeat, that some miracles began not with grand declarations, but with a shared silence and a page turned together. How long could this fragile truth endure before the town's teeth found it? The answer hung in the air, sharp as the scent of split wood and the unspoken promise in Micah's gaze. The ranch became a secret language of small, deliberate gestures, a lexicon only Hazel Marie and Micah understood. At dawn, he'd find her scissors, dulled from mending shirts and hemming curtains, sharpened and resting on the windowsill beside her sewing basket, a silent acknowledgement of her labor. The blade's edge caught the morning light, glinting like a promise that even the smallest acts of care would not go unseen. At dusk, she'd leave a tin of coffee by his door, its steam curling into the twilight like a whispered vow, the aroma mingling with the scent of sagebrush and cedar. They never spoke of these exchanges, yet they wove a tapestry of understanding tighter than words ever could. The children's laughter, once a fragile thread, now wove itself into her bones, their voices stitching her name into the air with a familiarity that felt like belonging. They called her Ma now, not because she corrected them, but because it had become instinct, a truth they'd claimed long before any paper or preacher could. When Jed tucked his chin into her shoulder after a nightmare, or Rosie traced constellations into the dust of the kitchen floor while recounting her day, Hazel Marie felt the weight of their trust settle into her chest, a warmth no winter could steal. Yet outside the ranch's borders, the town's venom seeped in like a slow-acting poison. Shopkeepers refused her coins with clipped words. Micah Lane should send his wife, one muttered, emphasizing the word like a curse. And Miriam Fay's hissed warnings slithered through the boarding house halls. A woman must be mindful of what she allows people to believe. Hazel Marie had tried to ignore it, to let the wind carry the barbs away. But the weight of their judgments pressed harder each day, a storm gathering on the horizon. The general store's proprietor began measuring her glances like flour in a scale, each interaction a test of her right to exist. At church, hymns rang hollow under the weight of sidelong stares, and Horace's sermons on decency seemed to linger longer when she entered the room. Even the children felt the shift. Their schoolmates' laughter turned sharp, their teachers' eyes darting away when Hazel Marie brought preserves to the Sunday potluck. Yet she kept coming, kept placing the jars on the table, kept walking past the whispering women on the porch. To stop would be to admit they could unmake her. Then came the icy morning when Hazel Marie packed her case again. Not to leave, not this time, but to prove she could choose. Her fingers trembled as she folded the shawl Micah had once found tangled on her porch rail, its frayed edges a testament to winter survived. She lingered over the letter from Boston, the one she'd stopped reading years ago, its creases worn thin as parchment. By the time she snapped the case shut, the sound echoed like a gunshot in the stillness. When Micah saw it by the door, he didn't ask questions, didn't press her to explain. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, his shadow stretching long across the floorboards, and said, "Peace never came from staying quiet." His voice was steady, but his eyes held a storm of their own, a quiet defiance that mirrored her own resolve. The sunlight caught the stubble on his jaw, the faint lines around his eyes, and in that moment, Hazel Marie saw the man who had chosen her not for her utility, but for her stubborn, unyielding heart. That afternoon, Horace summoned her after church, his voice grave as he lingered by the pulpit, the scent of old hymnals and candle wax heavy in the empty sanctuary. "There's talk," he said, his fingers tightening around his Bible. "This kind carries teeth." Hazel Marie stood motionless, her breath fogging in the cold air. What do they want? A confession? An apology? A public renunciation of the life she'd carved from silence and soil? She didn't have to wonder long. As she turned to leave, she caught the flicker of movement in the doorway. Micah, his frame cutting a dark silhouette against the light, his presence a warning unspoken. Why did his shadow darken the church doorway like that? Because he knew what she did. The town's patience had thinned, and its teeth were bared. Horace's sigh was a deflation, a man weary of battles he could not win. "They'll come for the children next," he murmured, almost to himself. "It's always about the children." Hazel Marie's throat tightened, but she nodded, her steps measured as she passed Micah. No words were needed. His hand brushed hers, rough and grounding, as they walked home. Outside, the wind carried the scent of impending snow, sharp and clean, but Hazel Marie felt no relief. The children's laughter echoed from the creek, where they chased frogs with reckless joy, unaware of the storm brewing beyond their world. She watched them, her throat tight, and wondered how long their innocence could shield them from the weight of other people's hatred. Jed's boots splashed through the shallows, Rosie's braids whipping behind her as she raced him to the willow tree, their joy a rebellion against the whispers that sought to claim them. That night, as she stirred porridge for supper, Micah entered without a word, his boots tracking mud across the floor. He took the pot from her hands, his fingers brushing hers, a fleeting touch that grounded her, and carried it to the table. They didn't speak of the case left unpacked by the bed, or Horace's warning, or the way Miriam Fay's gaze lingered on her during services, sharp as a blade. They didn't need to. The unspoken truth hung between them, heavy and unyielding. The town would not stop. It would claw at their edges, at their seams, until something gave. But Hazel Marie had spent too many years bending under the weight of other people's verdicts. She had packed her case not to flee, but to remind herself, and Micah, that she could choose. And when he met her gaze across the supper table, his eyes clear and unflinching, she knew he understood. Peace, he'd said, never came from staying quiet. And if the town wanted a fight, they'd find two souls who had already learned to stand, unyielding, in the face of the storm. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall, soft and relentless, blanketing the marigolds Hazel Marie had planted along the porch. Inside, the children's laughter echoed, a hymn of defiance louder than any sermon. The storm would come, but so would the morning. And in the quiet spaces between the howling wind, Hazel Marie felt the truth settle deep in her marrow. She was not a burden to outrun. She was a force they could not unmake. The council's verdict fell like a guillotine, its blades sharpened by hypocrisy and habit. Decency or the appearance of it. The elders had declared, their voices steeped in the sanctimony of men who'd never known hunger, grief, or the weight of a child's hand in theirs. Miriam Fay's petition, inked in looping script and dripping with fake piety, demanded Hazel Marie's exile, not for any crime, but for the sin of existing unapologetically. "What example does she set?" she hissed to the gathered crowd outside the church, her words a serpent's hiss wrapped in prayer. "A woman barren, unmarried, weaving herself into another's family like ivy strangling a fence post? We must protect our daughters from such confusion." The crowd murmured, their faces slack with the ease of complicity, until Micah's reply split the air like a gunshot. "You think I let them send you away?" he growled, his voice low and lethal, his body a wall between Hazel Marie and the vipers. The sanctuary trembled at his defiance, but Hazel Marie felt no triumph, only the cold familiarity of being a problem to be solved. Hadn't she always been a burden to outrun, a stain to be scrubbed from the town's conscience? That night, she stood on the porch of the ranch house, her fingers ghosting over Micah's shirt, a relic left draped on the railing, its cedar scent clinging to her palms like a promise she wasn't sure she deserved. The stars above were smothered by storm clouds, their bruised bellies threatening rain. "Shouldn't a proposal come with a ring?" she joked, her voice brittle as the wood beneath her feet. She didn't look at him, couldn't bear to see pity in his eyes. But when he turned toward her, his gaze was raw, unguarded, the kind of honesty that cut. "I'll never turn from you," he said, the words a vow etched into the marrow of the night. Hours later, as the first drops of rain spattered the earth, he knelt in the dirt, his hands pressing into the soil as though grounding himself. "You were always enough," he whispered, the confession swallowed by the wind. Hazel Marie's breath hitched, her throat tight with a lifetime of hearing the opposite. Then the thunderclap came, a sound so violent it seemed to split the sky itself. It shattered what? A secret? A curse? Or the fragile illusion that the town's hatred could ever be reasoned with? The storm raged as Silas Pritchard's wagon rolled into the valley at dawn, its wheels churning through mud like a harbinger of ruin. Micah's cousin, all polished boots and venomous charm, carried a contract in one hand and a smirk in the other. "Adopt the kids," he urged, his voice slick as oil. "Send her back east. Save what's left of your reputation." Hazel Marie listened from the shadows of the barn, her heart a clenched fist. When Micah refused, Silas's smile curdled into a sneer. "You'll regret this." Regret, Hazel Marie thought bitterly, was a currency she'd traded in for years. Yet as the storm clouds broke and sunlight bled through the gloom, she wondered if this was the moment the world would shift, when the thunderclap's echo would either bind her fate to Micah's or unravel everything they'd built. The rain soaked her to the bone, but she didn't move. Let them come, she thought. Let them all come. She'd spent too long shrinking. Now, she'd see what it meant to stand. The marriage was a shadow play of quiet defiance, its rituals etched into the rhythm of shared labor and unspoken trust. There were no vows, no ring, only two silhouettes moving through the dim light of the kitchen. Hazel Marie stirring porridge until the steam fogged the windows, Micah lifting the pot without a word to carry it to the table. Their hands brushed once, fleeting as a promise, but neither lingered. The children's laughter spilled through the door moments later, a rebellion against the town's venom. They chased frogs in the creek, their muddy boots tracked across the floorboards, their joy a wild thing that refused to be tamed. Yet even here, in the sanctuary of their ordinary days, the cracks began to show. Silas Pritchard arrived at dawn, his polished boots gleaming like weapons, his voice smooth as oil. He stepped onto the porch with the ease of a man who'd never known hunger or doubt, holding out a contract like a priest brandishing scripture. "Adopt the kids," he urged Micah, his gaze flicking to Hazel Marie like she was a stain on a landscape. "Send her back east. Ease the burden." Hazel Marie froze at the window, her breath catching on the edge of a memory. Another man, another refusal, another life left in tatters. When Micah's voice cut through the air, no, it was final, sharp as an axe splitting wood. Silas spat at his feet, his smile twisting into something bitter. "You'll regret this." Regret came sooner than anyone expected. A fire erupted in the chicken coop at midnight, its flames licking the sky like a curse. Hazel Marie woke to the scent of smoke, the children's screams slicing through the dark. Micah was already outside, hauling buckets of water, his face set in grim resolve. By dawn, the coop was ash, the chickens lost, the fields beyond it trampled by unseen hands. Sabotage followed, a row of wheat flattened, the irrigation pipes twisted until the water ran dry. The town's whispers sharpened, their barbs now edged with fear. "She's cursed." They hissed in the general store, in the church pews, in the shadowed corners where malice thrived. Hazel Marie heard them, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she knelt in the dirt beside Micah, her fingers digging into the scorched earth. "They want us to break," she murmured. "Let them wonder why we won't." Then came the blood-red moon, its glow painting the ranch in hues of rust and ruin. Miriam Fay appeared at the porch, her posture stiff, her voice trembling with something unfamiliar. "I came to see for myself." Hazel Marie opened the door slowly, her heart a drumbeat in her chest. The landlady's eyes swept the wreckage, the charred remnants of the coop, the children huddled on the porch, their faces smudged with soot but defiant. Micah stood behind Hazel Marie, his hand resting on the doorframe, a silent sentinel. What did Miriam Fay see in chaos? Perhaps the girl, Rosie, holding a mended toy, her chin lifted. The boy, Jed, clutching a scrap of wood carved with the word Ma. Or maybe she saw the way Hazel Marie's shoulders had stopped sagging, the way Micah's gaze never wavered, even as the world conspired to unmake them. Whatever it was, her lips parted as if to speak, then pressed into a thin line. "And I was wrong," she muttered, the words swallowed by the wind before she turned and walked away, her shadow shrinking into the night. Inside, Hazel Marie lit a candle, its flame trembling in the draft. Micah sank into the rocking chair, his boots heavy with dirt and fatigue. The children crept closer, their fear dissolving into whispered stories about the frogs they'd chased, the stars they'd named. Hazel Marie listened, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table, a relic of a life that had once felt too small to hold her. Outside, the fire's embers glowed faintly in the dark, but the porch light burned steady, a beacon against the shadows. They had lost much, but not everything. Not yet. And as the first hints of dawn bled into the sky, Hazel Marie wondered if resilience was not the absence of pain, but the choice to keep stirring the porridge, to keep carrying the pot, even when the world tried to starve them of hope. The ring arrived on a morning thick with the scent of damp earth and impending rain. A sliver of old fence wood, its grain roughened by years of wind and sun, the children's initials carved deep into its surface like a secret only they could decipher. Micah placed it in Hazel Marie's palm without ceremony, his calloused fingers lingering for a heartbeat before withdrawing. "They wanted you to have it," he muttered, his voice gruff but his eyes betraying a vulnerability that made her throat tighten. "Said you earned it." The ring was not smooth, not polished like the one sold in the general store's glass cases, but its edges were deliberate, a testament to hands that had shaped something enduring for broken things. Hazel Marie slipped it on her finger, its weight unfamiliar yet grounding, and looked up to find Micah watching her, his jaw clenched against an unspoken storm. "Do you ever wish they were yours?" she asked softly, the question trembling between them like a spiderweb in the wind. His answer came not as a rebuttal, but a growl, low and raw. "Peace never lives where small minds fester." The words hung in the air, sharp and final, yet they carried the ache of a man who had spent years silencing his own longing to shield those he loved from the world's venom. Days later, the stranger staggered onto the porch, a gaunt figure draped in a coat too thin for the season, his boots caked with mud and his breath reeking of whiskey. His eyes, bloodshot and unfocused, locked onto Micah with a grim familiarity. "Your cousin's raising hell in town," he slurred, leaning against the doorframe for support. "Says you're weak. Says this place will rot under your hand." Hazel Marie froze, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table as Micah stepped forward, his shadow swallowing the manhole. The drifter flinched but didn't retreat, his grin jagged and cruel. He's got folks listening. Whispers ain't enough for him no more. The room seemed to shrink, the air thickening with the weight of what was coming. That night, Hazel Marie lay awake, the ring's rough edges pressing into her skin as she traced its grooves, wondering if the initials carved there would someday fade, or if they'd etch themselves into her bones. Weakness arrived at dawn, not as a man, but as a mob. Torchlight flickered against the ranch house windows, casting jagged shadows that danced like specters. The chants rose first, a guttural chorus of outsider. Which? Shame. Then footsteps, heavy and purposeful, trampling the marigolds Hazel Marie had planted along the porch. Micah stood in the doorway, his rifle slack in his grip, its weight suddenly foreign in his hands. Hazel Marie pressed close behind him, her breath steady despite the thunder of her heart. "Let them come," she whispered, her voice a blade honed by years of swallowing fear. But Micah hesitated, his knuckles whitening around the rifle stock as the mob surged closer, their faces twisted by the firelight. For the first time, she saw doubt in his eyes, not for himself, but for what they'd built, for the children sleeping unaware in the next room. Then the drifter's horse bolted, startled by the chaos. The animal reared and plunged into the crowd, its hooves scattering the mob like dry leaves. A woman screamed. A torch clattered to the ground, sputtering out in the dirt. The man himself, still clinging to the porch rail, let out a bark of laughter, wild, unhinged, as if the universe had finally tipped in his favor. "Looks like God's got a sense of humor after all," he roared, his voice cracking. The mob faltered, their resolve unraveling as the horse galloped off into the fields, its riderless silhouette a mockery of their fury. One by one, the torchbearers turned and retreated, their chants dissolving into muttered curses. By the time the first rays of sunlight crested the hills, the yard was silent save for the crackle of dying embers and the faint, insistent chirp of a sparrow in the eaves. Inside, Micah lowered the rifle, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the night had finally settled into his marrow. Hazel Marie stepped past him, her gaze sweeping the porch where the drifter now slumped, half-conscious and grinning at the sky. She didn't speak to him, didn't waste a breath on questions or thanks. Instead, she reached for the coffee tin on the shelf, her hand steady as she filled 2 mugs. When she handed one to Micah, his fingers brushed hers, rough and grateful. "They'll try again," he said, his voice hoarse but resolute. "Maybe. But they'll find us waiting." Outside, the marigolds lay trampled but not uprooted, their petals still clinging to the soil like promises unbroken. The silence that followed was not peace, but the quiet of survival, a taut thread stretched between them as they stood at the threshold of their home. Hazel Marie's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the storm had rolled away, leaving the air sharp with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Micah's hand rested on the doorframe, his knuckles pale from the grip, as if steadying himself against the aftershocks of fear he'd refused to show. The children slept on, unaware of the night's violence, their dreams undisturbed by the world's cruelty. Yet the house itself seemed to hold its breath, the walls trembling with the echoes of what had nearly been lost. When Micah finally spoke, his voice was low, frayed at the edges. "They'll come back. Not tonight, but soon." Hazel Marie nodded, her throat tight. She thought of Miriam Fay's barbed remarks, the shopkeeper's refusal of her coins, the way the town's whispers had coiled around her like a noose. They had tried to carve her into a ghost, a cautionary tale of a woman too broken to belong. But here, In the wreckage of their judgment, she had found something unnameable, a life stitched together by hands that refused to let go. She reached for Micah's hand, the ring's rough edges pressing into his palm as she intertwined their fingers. "Let them come," she repeated, the words softer now, but no less fierce. The drifter's laughter had died into a drunken snore. His body crumpled against the porch rail like discarded trash. Micah stepped forward, hauling him upright with a grunt, his movements efficient but not cruel. "Get up," he muttered, dragging the man toward the barn. Hazel Marie watched, her mug of coffee cooling in her hands, as Micah bound the drifter's wrists with rope and left him a blanket. There was no kindness in the gesture, only the grim pragmatism of a man who knew how easily survival could slip away. When he returned, his eyes met hers, and in them she saw the unspoken truth. They were both too tired for heroics, too worn by the weight of standing against the tide. Yet they would stand, as they always had, because the alternative was to crumble. By midday, the marigolds had begun to right themselves, their petals trembling but unbowed in the breeze. Hazel Marie knelt among them, brushing dirt from their stems, her fingers working with the quiet precision of someone who understood resilience. Micah worked beside her, his hands steady as he replanted the uprooted flowers, their roots tangled with the soil of a land that had once rejected them. The children emerged from the house, their laughter tentative at first, then bold, as if testing whether the world had returned to normal. Jed knelt beside Hazel Marie, his small hands mimicking hers, while Rosie hummed to him she'd sung in the courtroom, a melody that had silenced a room full of hatred. That night, as they gathered around the hearth, the firelight flickered across their faces, etching their defiance into the walls. Hazel Marie traced the grain of the ring, its grooves a map of everything they had survived. Micah's hand rested on her knee, his thumb brushing the fabric of her skirt in a rhythm older than words. They did not speak of the mob, the drifter, or the cousin's threats. Instead, they listened to the children's stories, their voices weaving a tapestry of ordinary moments: a frog caught in the creek, a bird's nest discovered in the eaves, the way the wind had carried the scent of rain. In the quiet that followed, Hazel Marie leaned into Micah's shoulder, her head resting against the cedar scent of his coat. The world beyond their porch might never accept them, but here, in the glow of the fire and the warmth of shared breath, they had carved a sanctuary from the chaos. The ring on her finger, the marigolds outside the window, the children's laughter echoing in the rafters, all of it was proof that some miracles stayed quiet, growing strongest not in the light of day, but in the shadows where no one thought to look. The courtroom was a pressure cooker of resentment and sweat, its walls lined with shelves of dusty law books that hadn't been opened in decades. The air hung thick with the scent of pipe smoke and unwashed bodies, the creak of overcrowded chairs blending with the judge's impatient tapping of his gavel. The town's elders sat in a row like judges of old, their faces etched with the self-importance of men who'd never questioned the weight of their own authority. Their demands were sharp, almost gleeful. "Bring the kids. Let's see if they've been poisoned against us." The words slithered through the room, met with nods from the crowd. A sea of bonnets and straw hats, eyes narrowed with suspicion. When Rosie stepped forward, her small frame trembled, but her chin lifted as if guided by some invisible force. She didn't speak. Instead, her voice sliced through the stifling air, trembling yet unwavering, as she sang the hymn Hazel Marie had taught her weeks ago. The melody hung like a specter, its notes piercing the brittle facade of the trial, slicing through the crowd's collective breath. Jed followed, his freckled face defiant, the wooden scrap clutched in his hand. The word "mama" was carved clumsily, the letters uneven, but the message was a thunderclap, a declaration etched in a splintered wood that silenced even the flies buzzing near the windows. Micah's laugh rumbled low, a sound that carried both pride and warning, as if he'd been waiting years to let it loose. "They're learning to write," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest, his eyes locking onto the judge's gaunt face. The judge, a man whose bony hand seemed too large for his frail frame, slammed the gavel down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. "Order!" he barked, but the room had already shifted. The children's defiance had cracked the facade of the proceedings, exposing the raw truth beneath. This wasn't about loyalty or morality. It was about fear, the town's desperate need to control what it could not understand. Outside, as the trial staggered toward its inevitable conclusion, the drifter's body swayed in the wind, hanging from the courthouse tree like a grotesque ornament. The note pinned to his chest with a hunting knife read, "Leave them be," the ink smudged as if written in haste. The crowd murmured uneasily, but it was Miriam Fay who froze, her face paling as she read the words. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Who had left the note? And why did the handwriting, the looping script, the deliberate strokes, remind her of the son she'd buried decades ago, the one who died before he could draw his first breath? The answer clung to her like a ghost, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned away, her footsteps hurried, her composure unraveling with every step. Inside, the judge's voice grew shrill, his rulings drowned out by the children's hymn still echoing in Hazel Marie's mind. When the verdict came, a hollow reprimand for disorderly conduct, Micah gripped Hazel Marie's hand beneath the table, his calloused fingers grounding her. The walk home was silent, the children trailing behind, their wooden mama clutched tightly in Jed's grip. That night, as the family gathered around the hearth, Hazel Marie traced the grain of the ring Micah had given her, its edges rough but true. The drifter's body would be buried by dawn, his warning ignored by some, heeded by others. But here, in this room where a hymn had silenced a courtroom and a child's carving had defied a town's cruelty, peace lingered. Not because it was easy, but because they'd chosen to carve it from the chaos themselves. The firelight flickered across their faces, casting long shadows that danced like the ghosts of the trial's absurdity. Hazel Marie's fingers brushed the wooden ring, its grooves a tactile reminder of all they'd endured. Micah sat stiff-backed, his jaw clenched, but his hand rested on Rosie's shoulder as she dozed against his side. Jed lay sprawled on the rug, the carved mama tucked beneath his cheek like a talisman. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters, but inside, the hearth's warmth held firm. Hazel Marie leaned into Micah, her head resting against the cedar scent of his coat, and wondered if resilience was not the absence of storm, but the choice to build a shelter within it. The judge's verdict would fade into the town's gossip, another footnote in their saga of rejection. But here, in the quiet home of a family bound not by blood but by choice, the hymn's final notes still lingered, a promise that some truths, once sung, could never be unsung. Years later, the ranch hummed with the rhythm of resilience, a symphony of mended fences, sun-drenched marigolds, and the steady pulse of a life built not by chance but by choice. The children, now grown into adults whose laughter still carried the echo of their childhood mischief, argued over who had inherited Hazel Marie's stubbornness. The girl, Rosie, had her mother's sharp wit and Micah's unyielding patience, while the boy Jed had Hazel Marie's quiet intensity and Micah's calloused hands. Calluses earned not from labor, but from carving wooden letters into fence posts, practicing until the word mama became a testament etched into the land itself. Their debates filled the kitchen, spilling into the fields where they worked side by side, their voices rising above the wind like a hymn to the life they'd claimed. Yet the past, like a thorn buried deep, clawed back when a train screeched to a halt at the dusty platform, its iron wheels kicking up ghosts. A widower from Boston stepped off, his face lined with regret, and a letter stained by tears clutched in his trembling hands. "Hazel Marie," he called, his voice cracking as he read aloud from the paper. "If you're still there, I'll wait." The words hung in the air, brittle and desperate. A plea for a man who had spent decades unraveling the lie that regret could be outrun. Micah found her at the porch, the letter trembling in her hand like a leaf caught in a storm. He didn't speak at first, just stood behind her, his shadow merging with hers in the fading light. "Go," he said finally, his voice roughened by years of swallowing pride for the sake of love. But Hazel Marie laughed, a sound like wind chimes startled in a song by a sudden gust, and tossed the paper into the fire. The flames devoured the words, their glow painting her face in hues of defiance. "I was never enough for him," she whispered, her gaze steady as she turned to face him. "But I am for you." The admission hung between them, raw and unvarnished, a truth that needed no embellishment. That night, as stars peppered the sky like scattered seeds, Micah carved a new ring from the stake that once bore the drifter's warning, "Leave them be." The wood was darkened by years of weather, its grain twisted by time, yet his knife moved with purpose, shaping something enduring from the remnants of violence. When Hazel Marie asked, "What's it mean?" he held it out, its edges rough but its form deliberate. "Proof," he said, his voice low, "that some miracles stay quiet." The ring joined the one the children had given her, its presence a silent dialogue between past and present. Hazel Marie slipped it onto her finger, feeling the weight of all it symbolized: the fire, the mob, the drifter's body swaying in the wind, and the unspoken pact that had kept them standing when the world demanded their surrender. Outside, the coyotes howled at dawn, their song a primal question echoing across the hills. Who followed their song into the unknown? Not Hazel Marie, who had spent a lifetime chasing approval only to find it in the unlikeliest of places, a man who had never asked for anything but her presence, her stubborn refusal to shrink. Not Micah, who had learned that peace was not the absence of storm, but the choice to build a shelter within it. Perhaps it was the town itself, still whispering, still clinging to its judgments, now forced to reckon with the quiet miracle of a barren woman who had become the root of a family. Or maybe it was the children, carrying forward the legacy of a love that had never shouted but had always stayed. As the first light of morning spilled across the porch, Hazel Marie leaned into Micah's shoulder, her head resting against the cedar scent of his coat. The coyote song faded into the rustle of wind through marigolds, and in that moment, the unknown felt not like a threat but a promise, that some miracles, the truest ones, are not announced with fanfare, but etched into the ordinary, the unseen, the enduring.